So default constraint will specify a default value when a value is not specified for a particular column on which the default constraint is applied. So what in an insert query, if any value is not specified for this column, then the default value will be inserted into the column. So if you see this example, there is a DDL statement which creates a table by the name myTable1, and they have this default constraint on this ID column, which is of type int, and they are defaulting the value as 15,000 or 1500, right? And they have a name column of type n varchar 50, and then they are adding a constraint with the constraint name and then adding a default. And the default name that they're giving for all the employees is Pankaj. So if you miss to add any name of the employees or in this table, in the name column, it will default it to Pankaj. Right? And the salary by default is 100. So this is how you use the default constraint while creating the table. And the other way you can do is by alter table command. You can alter table, give the table name, add constraint. Constraint name is default, right? And then the default keyword and the values that you want to give. That you can do. So let's see how we can implement this. So I'll change it to default. Constraint, let's create a table by the name employee default. Default. So let's keep this constraint. Let's keep this constraint. So gender, let's default it to gender default. Default value, let's say it's other as default, right? So if we are not giving any value, it should default it to other. And let's create this table now. So while creating this table, I'm getting an error, right? Let's look at the error one more time. It says there is already an object by the name salary more than 5,000, right? So it says this constraint name already exists. And why does it exist? Because we have the same name in this table, employees check, right? So whenever you have a constraint defined in any of the table, you need to make sure the constraint name should be unique across all the data, across the database. So if a database has 100 tables and each table has one constraint name defined, so that name should be unique across the tables. Same name you cannot use in multiple tables, right? Because this constraint name was already taken in this table, employees check. And so now we cannot use the same name. So if I give it _1, right? So this will work now because the name is now changed to a unique name, and this worked. So this is one thing you need to remember whenever you define a constraint in any of the table in the database. You need to make sure the constraint name that you are providing is unique and is not already present in any other table in the same database. Right? Clear on this part? Why we got that error and what was the reason for that?
Yes, man.
Yeah. So for this table, now we have three constraints. One is not null. One, we are checking the salary should be more than 5,000. And then we have a default constraint on the gender part. Let's see how it works. Oh, sorry, I already created a table. Okay, let's insert the values in this table. So the table name is employees default. This is an ideal scenario. Everything matches, everything is fine. It gets inserted. So now let's see, I have one more insert statement. Employees default, employee ID, employee name, and salary, right? I'm intentionally not adding the gender column here, and I pass the employee ID as 101, name as Sam, gender, for example, I forgot to mention, and salary, let's say 20,000, right? So what happens in this case, right? So while inserting into this table, I'm only inserting the values for employee ID, employee name, and salary. I forgot to add the gender column, right, by mistake. So if I run this now, the insert still works, and let's do a select and see what happens. Select star from employees default. You see the gender here, what it came? It came as O.
0. Default value 0.
Yeah, because we had a default value for other O, right? So even though we missed to give a value for this employee default column, sorry, gender column in this insert statement, it took the default value as O. It did not keep it null, right? So this is how default constraint works. So scenarios like where you have this amount columns in production, right? There will be tables in which you will have the amount columns, and then you will have to use those columns to get some count or sum, right? So if there is a null value, the sum might not be proper and the count will not be proper, because the count, when you take, it will ignore the null values, right? So in that case, we always default that salary columns by 0.0, right? So that even though there is no value for that particular column, it will default it to 0, so that the counts will at least match. It will not fail, or it will not give us incorrect counts. So that is one use case of the default constraint. So clear on this, how we use default constraints?
Yes, Bhaiya.
So as and when we are moving ahead, we will be adding all the constraints. Like, so now we have 3 constraints: default, not null, check constraints. So we'll keep on adding these constraints as we go down, and we need to make sure every time we create a constraint, the constraint name should be unique. And this is something we need to keep in mind, right?